At the end of 2006, Michael Schumacher retired after having what many might describe as the perfect career. 91 wins, a record at the time, 68 pole positions, a record at the time, 7 world championships, a record at the time, and that's just the black and white stats. The journey along the way, which included his legendary debut, title controversies, drama right up until his final season, and being the man to bring a Drivers' Championship back to Ferrari after more than 20 years, is what really made his legacy. By his own admission, he was mentally drained at the end of both 2005 and 2006. Despite a little bit of Ferrari drama in the background, on the surface he left on his own terms and got the hero send-off that he deserved, and the Michael Schumacher era as we knew it was over. But it wasn't. Although we didn't know it back then, the Schumacher era wasn't over, it was just on pause, because in 2010, at the age of 41, Michael was back. After a 3-year hiatus, Michael would announce his return in December of 2009 with the newly rebranded Mercedes team, which bought the Brawn team that in 2009 won both the Constructors and Drivers titles with Jenson Button. During Michael's retirement, he himself admitted that the passion to race never actually went away. He spent his retirement racing bikes and still being a Ferrari advisor, meaning that during 07, 08 and 09, he was always there on the periphery. Even that in itself showed that in some way, Michael was still hanging on to Formula 1. In 2008 and 2009, he even tested for Ferrari, and when Felipe Massa had his accident in Hungary 2009 that put him out for the rest of the season, originally Schumacher was supposed to be the one to replace him, but a lingering neck injury ruled him out of a mid-season return. Even so, just the possibility of a return reignited something in Michael. I never left the racetrack. I was tired of F1 by the end of 2006, but in 3 years of absence, I got back all of the energy that I'm feeling right now. I played around with motorbikes, and I feel ready for some serious stuff now. To tell the truth, the failed comeback attempt last summer gave me reason to reconsider my situation. I was surprised myself how fast and how strong I committed myself to this topic again. Apparently my batteries recharged completely during the last 3 years, and when, thanks to Ross, the opportunity arose to drive for Mercedes GP, I realized that my old motivation was back. The hype around Michael Schumacher's return to Formula 1 and with the reigning World Championship team was absolutely immense. Michael became a global icon at Ferrari during the early 2000s, and on his comeback, whether the noise was positive or negative, with skepticism about why a 41-year-old with 7 world titles even needed to return to Formula 1, Michael showed that he could still dominate the headlines. Going into the season, every single driver was asked about the return of Schumacher, and you could see that even after 3 years out of the sport, there was still a buzz from the other drivers at the prospect of racing Michael Schumacher.
But I'm really happy to see him back. I think it's great for the sport, great for all the fans, and for all us drivers. You know, we're all very much huge fans of his and what he's achieved. So to be in the same race as him and to be on the grid with him, it's going to be a great experience.
The Mercedes factor also can't be underplayed. With the power of Mercedes and Ross Brawn, Michael knew that it had the right money and leadership behind it. It was a serious team that was worth his comeback, which is why he underlined his commitment by signing a 3-year contract. Michael himself also didn't exactly slow down the hype train. Naturally, when a driver of that stature returns with the championship-winning team, talk of an 8th world title was inevitable. And in hindsight, whilst the fanfare and pressure of talking about challenging for an 8th world title immediately probably did more harm than good in the long term, Michael made his intentions clear on what the goal was for him and Mercedes. I have won it 7 times and I'm with the team that won both titles last season, so what do you expect? You can't expect anything else other than to go for the World Championship, and that's what we're aiming for. Talking about an 8th world title unfortunately was as close as Michael got on his F1 comeback. In the 3 years that he spent with Mercedes up against teammate Nico Rosberg, Nico ended up beating Michael in all 3 years. In the end, the time at Mercedes almost became a footnote in his career because the reality never lived up to the expectations. Now, of course, Michael never got a championship level car, but you have to perform with whatever car you're given. And it became obvious that whether or not Michael was as quick as he was when he was dominating with Ferrari, this was a new era, with new drivers in their physical and mental peak, and I do think that whatever car you would have put him in, at the time, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, they were in a different league. Even so, what often gets forgotten is that even as Michael was getting older, in terms of pure pace, he was actually getting more and more competitive as the years went on. The comeback in 2010 was the rough one, and there's no getting away from that. In qualifying, the head-to-head was 14.5 to Nico, with Michael being 0.246% slower on average. In the races, accounting for outliers and reliability, Michael only finished ahead of Nico 3 times with some really strong 4th place finishes in Spain, Turkey and Korea. But it was Nico who delivered the headline results for Mercedes, with 3 3rd place podiums in Malaysia, China and Britain. In the end, the points tally spoke for itself, with Nico scoring almost double the points that Michael did, with 142 compared to just 72. 2011 and 2012 would see Michael become more competitive with the car and get closer to Nico. Even though the qualifying gap in 2011 was actually the biggest it would ever be, in the races Michael was a lot closer and would finish only 13 points behind Nico. In 2012, Michael would further build on that improved pace, matching Nico in quali and also in the race head-to-head. But reliability issues, some messy weekends and big points finishes for Nico kind of skews the points total compared to how close the two actually were. The problem for Schumacher, especially in 2010, is that he didn't adapt well on his comeback to the Mercedes W01, and this was actually a legacy from 2009 when the team was Brawn. One of the amazing things about the Brawn story of 2009 is that even though they won the championship, they actually didn't have enough money to really develop the car throughout the season, and by the end, the team even struggled to get on the podium, with Jenson Button hanging on to that championship lead that he had built up early on. When Mercedes bought and took over Brawn, it was so late in 2009 that the 2010 Mercedes was actually an underdeveloped 2009 Brawn that was shortened to fit a smaller fuel tank, as for 2010 refueling was now banned. What all of this has to do with Michael is that the 2009 Brawn, which carried over into the 2010 Mercedes, was built completely around Jenson Button's driving style, which was almost the polar opposite of Michael's. Button was a classically smooth driver both with his steering inputs and also in his throttle application. He liked a car that had a really nice balance from front to rear, which in his hands also made it easier on the brakes and tyres. The famous Schumacher style that went back even to his Benetton days, and that Ferrari literally built their entire car philosophy around to suit Michael, was to have a very sharp front end which he could use to pin the car to the apex, but with a more unbalanced rear which he could use to rotate the car on entry. Now that's a very basic explanation, but what it means is that when you have a driver who for 20 years had built his career on a specific style and always had the car designed for him, when you put that driver after 3 years out the sport into Button's Brawn that was just painted silver, Schumacher ultimately wasn't able to adapt as well on his comeback and wasn't able to get the best out of himself. Now, for 2011 and 2012, the team was able to put a lot more of their own fingerprint, and in truth, the 2011 car was actually the first real Mercedes of the modern era. It's difficult to say how much better the car was suited to Michael because when you have a young driver outperforming your 7-time world champion, you can't exactly then develop the car around the driver who has been outperformed in the here and now, regardless of his past success. Despite that, throughout the 3 years there were moments of brilliance where even though he wasn't fighting for wins or the championship, you could see glimpses of what people even then called the Schumacher magic. Great forgotten drives like at Spa 2011, which was the weekend where he actually celebrated 20 years since making his F1 debut in 1991, running a gold helmet to mark the occasion. The weekend actually started off pretty badly when in qualifying, he had a car failure which crashed him out in Q1, meaning he started stone dead last for his 20th anniversary race. However, whether that was just the motivation that Michael needed, I don't know, but he absolutely stormed through the field, and after a few clever strategy calls early on, he went from 24th to finishing in 5th, even overtaking Nico along the way, who actually led the race early on. Canada 2011 was a race where we got glimpses of Schumi's ability in the wet that originally gave him the name the Rainmaster. For much of that race, he kept a calm head and looked like he might be able to grab a podium, but as the track dried, the pace of Webber's Red Bull and Button's McLaren cruelly saw Michael just drop out of the podium with just 2 laps to go. And then of course we have Valencia 2012. Out and out, I wouldn't say that this was Michael's best drive on pure performance. Again, I think Spa 2011 was arguably better, but finally luck went his way. In a race of attrition where we saw Vettel, Massa, Grosjean, Hamilton, Button, and even Maldonado of all people have races to forget, Michael and Mercedes played the strategy right, having fresh tyres at the end, and finally on his Mercedes comeback, we would see the great Michael Schumacher on an F1 podium again. Peppered throughout the 3 years at Mercedes, there were glimpses of why this man in his prime was arguably the greatest of all time. None more so than his most iconic moment in silver, setting pole position at the 2012 Monaco Grand Prix. This lap, even to this day, gets shared on social media, and it's not difficult to see why. That weekend, the Merc had genuine pace around the Principality, with even Rosberg qualifying in 3rd, but Michael produced a classic. This lap on the F1 channel has over 3.5 million views, and if you haven't seen it before, I'll have a link to it below. It's a driver right on the limit, with my favourite part being when Michael goes through the swimming pool, he takes his left hand off the steering wheel to make a mid-corner brake bias adjustment, one-handed through the left-right of swimming pool. I mean, come on, it is just pure magic. However, there is also something about that moment that I think almost perfectly summarizes the two sides of Michael Schumacher's Mercedes comeback. Despite producing one of the most legendary laps of all time, he did not get to start on pole position because he had a 5-place grid penalty that he had to serve from the previous race. In Spain, Michael had a collision with Bruno Senna, and whichever way you want to look at it, it was Michael's fault and he did deserve the penalty. The flip side to those moments of magic from the old Michael is that whether it was his ability degrading away, or whether it was his age and reflexes going, Michael not only lacked consistency, but also became a little too used to having needless incidents, especially in wheel-to-wheel combat. No better example than the back-to-back crashes in consecutive years at Singapore, especially the 2012 crash when Michael locked up, completely misjudging his braking and piling into the back of Jean-Eric Vergne, for which he would receive a 10-place grid penalty. It was an incident that looked very clumsy, and rightly or wrongly, it again shined the spotlight on, was Michael's time coming to an end? It's difficult to say what part that Singapore crash had in the decision and the timing, but for what it's worth, after the Singapore Grand Prix, Michael would announce his retirement.
I've decided to retire by the end of the year, although I'm still able and capable to compete with the best drivers that are around. But at some point, it's good to say goodbye, and it might this time even be forever.
His comeback, in the end, being brutally honest, wasn't a success, and I do think that it damaged his legacy more than added to it, so much so that people do try to almost disregard it. I was watching a random Autosport video about Michael from a few years ago, and there was a very interesting throwaway comment that one of the journalists made.
Okay, what's next?
I also think the F310 should go higher, certainly above the 2012 Merc, because I kind of feel that Schumacher's second career almost doesn't really count. He was injured, he wasn't as usual.
Doesn't really count. The truth is, it does count. But the reason why it hurts to look back on his time at Mercedes is precisely because of how good he was in his quote-unquote first career. It wasn't the same as what Alonso is doing now, well into his 40s, because the perception of the two is very different. Fernando proved the critics wrong. He was actively headhunted by Aston Martin, and some people even still consider him to be a top 5 driver on the grid. Michael was never in those discussions. But even if on the track the reality never lived up to the expectations, what Michael did to help develop the Mercedes team was his biggest achievement on his comeback. More than the podium, more than the pole position lap. If you listen to any of the Mercedes team who were there right from the beginning, you will know that what Michael did inside the team, his professionalism, the championship mentality that he brought, and more than anything else, the hard work and dedication that he showed, he was the one who started the Mercedes winning culture that we see today. I've always thought that it was very poetic that it was Michael Schumacher who made way to the new era of Lewis Hamilton, the man that would go on to beat his records and match his world championships. As drivers, Michael laid the foundations along with Ross Brawn, and then Lewis and Toto built those foundations with their brand new energy into a team even more dominant than the Ferrari that Michael had helped to build. In a way, even if his Mercedes comeback on track didn't do anything to add to his massive legacy, his fingerprint on Mercedes and Formula One, even to this day, still lives on.